Greetings from Dr. Kate. This is the last lecture for the course, and I'm going to talk to you about specifically how one does a meta-analysis and what that's all about. As you can see from my subtitle here, this is what I did to complete my doctoral studies as far as the methodology. So here goes. Like many things for us in social science, meta-analysis as a technique is something that we borrowed from the quote-unquote hard sciences. Folks in, for example, chemistry will be frequently doing meta-analysis technique in order to do recalculations. Meta-analysis means that you're going to gather the data on something like an element's weight and volume and mass, and over time there are slight shifts or variations in that what looks official on the elements charts. All the statistical meta-analysis is bringing together what as many sources have found, and then taking a new look at it, which I'll explain shortly, and seeing do adjustments need to be made. Now, in the social sciences, and again, the hard sciences have been doing this in multiple ways for many years. This is something that we've kind of borrowed the approach, and instead of recalculating things like the elements, what we are doing is looking at effect sizes. What that means is we are taking a look at the results of what other people have found in a very specific field, and we want to see what is an overall relationship between two variables, an independent variable and whatever the dependent variable is that's being measured. So rather than asking what's the relationship between an IV and DV, we're looking at what's the relationship between an independent variable and the overall effect it has on X or a dependent variable. So what is the point of doing this in the social sciences? Well, it's not just reviewing the literature. Like when you take a look at anybody's study, they start out with, kind of this overview. Here's what other people have found in a given area. It's more than that. What we're trying to do with meta-analysis technique is say, based upon all the studies that fit criteria, which I'll talk about, here's what's been found in a more general way. This is the overall estimate of the effect of something. One positive about it is that it decreases or minimizes what one particular study or a handful of studies have found. There are folks who are well known in pretty much any field of social science. So when these individuals or teams of researchers publish something, it often will get more credibility or more attention than if Kate Sobiak publishes. Although I guess I've gotten a little bit in the meta-analysis field, but other things that I've published on don't make, let's say, a huge splash in the research world compared with those who might devote their lifetime to a particular topic area. Now, I'm going to walk you through what I did when I was studying needle exchange programs. I, for some reason, had a fascination with HIV and its transmission. At one point, one of my advisors said to me, if you really want to do something that makes a difference, why don't you study the needles, the injection drug users? And at that time, I thought, oh, I want to instead just study how can I make a training program that might be used in a suburban high school. And my advisor said, well, that's nice, but there's really not risk for HIV in that population, unlike with injection drug users that has a very high risk because of the dual transmission. So I didn't really know much about needle exchange programs, but I did quickly find out that they are controversial because the regulation of them is a state by state decision. So a governor one day can just pull a needle exchange program from a state, just say it's illegal, and then open one in another state on the same day. Obviously, people who are doing injection drug use are injecting illegal substances almost entirely. And people who do that kind of thing are not out in the open, so that's why we call it a hard to reach population. Needle exchange programs are meant to reduce the risk related to the injection behavior. Now, in theory, people probably think that's a good idea. The NIMBY that I have here means not in my backyard, which, as you can probably imagine, you wouldn't want necessarily there to be a clinic that offers needle exchange in the vicinity of where you live, because it's going to attract a certain population, and falsely or not, the belief is that then it's going to make a neighborhood less safe. People who are opposed to needle exchange don't really trust the data that was collected, which overall does tend to say there are positive impacts or effects, if you will, for folks that use clean needles. That the more you do that, the less likely you are to, for one, acquire HIV. So people who are opposed to NEPs or needle exchange programs are more likely to believe that there are negative outcomes. Like if you give needles out in a neighborhood, then there's going to be a lot of discarded needles in that neighborhood that can end up poking children and those kinds of fears. So how do you end up doing a meta-analysis? You'll have to do a very extensive literature search using all different kinds of sites. When I did this for the needle exchange program, I ended up with about 5,000 hits totally, meaning 5,000 possible articles. Part of the job, which I didn't really expect, was that you get to read each article and decide if it is useful. Now, how you decide it's useful is that you have to create inclusion criteria. That means what kinds of articles fit your intention for this meta-analysis. So during the time I was doing this technique, I took any articles initially that were published between 1988 and July 1st, like mid-July 2001. Now, it was journal articles, but also anyone's dissertations, any kind of state reports that were authored by academics. Because I didn't have resources, the only ones I could include had to be published in English. I took articles regardless of where the study was conducted. At first, I was just going to do US studies, but then as long as I was doing it, I figured I might as well expand it to whatever articles are published worldwide. And something that should look familiar to you are the methodological restrictions or lack of them. I took articles that were looking at folks who attended needle exchange over time and their behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs, as well as those that took a cross-sectional approach, which tended to be people who used a needle exchange versus people who didn't use a needle exchange at one point in time. So how do you decide which ones to use? If an article had anything about return rates of needles, meaning how many were distributed versus how many were returned, I decided to use that information as kind of a separate analysis. Articles had to include some kind of change over time, that's longitudinal, or comparison data, meaning that they were looking at needle exchange attenders versus non-attenders. So it had to have change over time or comparison data in the articles. So after starting out with thousands of possibilities, I really only ended up with 64 articles that had change or comparison data. And then an additional about 15 also just had return rate data. Meta-analysis requires you to figure out some kind of a coding scheme. So anything that the articles indicated about how many males versus females, again, the needles in, needles out, location, was it a clinic? Was it somebody going around in a van? Was it people just kind of going through parks with needles in their backpacks? Anything I could find is what I tried to code for. And unfortunately, there wasn't a real standard way of collecting data, so I ended up with 83 individual dependent variables, which makes life messy. We could have one article that measured multiple dependent variables. Anytime something was considered usable data, that was called an instance or a case. So you can see while I had 83 separate dependent variables, one article could be measuring multiple outcomes or dependent variables. The part I really wasn't expecting was that I had to figure out if whatever they found was a positive, meaning a desirable outcome, or an undesirable outcome. So some things are pretty obvious. We're trying to reduce needle sharing. That's why you provide the sterile equipment. So if needle sharing goes down over time, that's a desirable outcome. But there were other things that were less clear to me, like using bleach, which is common to clean your used needles to try to get rid of some of the germs and such. So if you think about it, if you don't use as much bleach over time, is that because you are being less careful? Or does that mean you're going to use clean needles instead, so your use of bleach is going to go down? Anytime there was any doubt about a result being desirable or undesirable, I coded it as undesirable. So it didn't look like I was trying to slant the data in any way. like being pro needle exam. People present the results in different ways. And what we had to do was, first of all, figure out what it is, what's the outcome, what was the data, and then we wanted to convert everything to the same statistic. That's what's called a common metric. Now, you might remember with correlations that it's R equals somewhere between a negative 1.0 and a positive 1.0. Well, no matter how the data was collected, I had to do hand conversions to make all the data as R's or correlations. And most of the data was actually presented as percentages. They would compare those who went to a needle exchange program and the likelihood they shared needles in the past month. So you'd get something like this, a little table, 50% who attend needle exchange programs admitted to sharing one or more times in the last month, and 80% of those who didn't go also said they shared. And I would have to take that information and then create a conversion. And these were the most likely that the data in the articles was presented as percentages or it was presented as a chi-square statistic. So not that you need to know this, but these were the formulas I was most familiar with having to use. So taking a chi-square and converting it to a correlation meant I took the square root of the chi-square divided by the total number of subjects, and that equals a correlation. The percentage was D, which is the percentage, the statistic. D times the square root of D squared plus 4 will give you a correlation. Why is that the formula? I don't know. I was basically just doing what I was told with my mentor, and then we compare our answers. Because I had so many dependent variables, I ended up doing something kind of unusual at the time, at least, and that was that I created classifications of variables. So any study that just said it was needle sharing, I called that pure needle sharing. That's what they were measuring. That was one category or classification. And you can see the others that people were measuring: HIV rate, injection frequency, risky sex behaviors, and so on. Anything that wasn't pure needle sharing, I created into a new category. So what did I find? Overall, that there were desirable results for a decline in HIV rate and the needle sharing type of behaviors, being safer with your preparation of drugs, and how the syringe was used, as well as knowledge about HIV and other blood-borne and sexually transmitted diseases. However, there really wasn't much of an desirable outcome for risky injection drug use, meaning just because you used a needle exchange didn't mean you were less likely to inject in public, let's say. Injection frequency didn't change, which in a way was a positive result because critics would think that you give people needles and then they're going to inject more, and that was not the case. Of course, the needle exchange programs weren't giving them drugs as well, so it didn't really alter the frequency of injection. Or the safer use of paraphernalia like cookers and other kinds of things that can also contain disease. Risky sexual behaviors actually slightly increased in that folks who use needle exchange were then less likely to use condoms in their sexual activities. So that some would call a compensatory effect, just like if you are driving. When seatbelts were required, what folks found was, researchers that is, that those who use seatbelts actually drove faster, which, of course, put you at risk for injuries if you had an accident. So the psychological term is compensatory effect, that if you do one thing, then you do something kind of in the opposite. So if you use clean needles, then you figure, well, then I don't need to use condoms. Kind of a similar finding. So what was the point of doing this? Yeah, what was my big claim to fame? Well, no one else had really done it before. So there's always a first in meta-analysis. Strengths of what I did as well was rather than just summarizing articles, which others had done, I did that statistical conversion of the data for others to use as they will. Now, it's not entirely objective, but it does provide readers with, here's the overall findings in as objective of a way as I can, and I'm not giving any more weight to one study over another. Difficulties with my particular meta-analysis was that I pretty much only use published studies, and people who publish tend to have significant findings. So if those are the articles you're going to use, then you're going to probably also find significance. I thought, given how many I started with as possible articles, there really weren't that many in the end that were 64 isn't a ton that I could use. And while I found a lot of little pieces of data, there wasn't really consensus about what should be studied in relationship to needle exchange programs beyond if you share needles or not. The populations that I had through the studies were heterogeneous, meaning I was looking at all around the world, all different kinds of locations, even within the United States. People had clinics for the programs versus vans versus roving individuals. So I could not figure out how to statistically get the population to be homogeneous. And there's all sorts of different kinds of techniques that are used for that. And despite how many times I tried with different ideas, this means that I can't say, so the results that I had represent all injection drug users, because honestly, just like all sorts of things in the world, injection drug users come in all shapes and sizes from all walks of life, and my data couldn't make this a similar population with the techniques I used. And I just have to say that. It's, I guess, ideal if I could have figured that out, but I could not. This is when you try to say, what might be a moderator or some kind of a reason that we could control for. So one thing could be where the needle exchange program was located. So country of origin. That was a failed attempt. A lot of the studies didn't give me enough information to be able to say, well, maybe we could control for gender. Maybe we could control for type of drug used. That wasn't always available, and because it wasn't, I wasn't really able to try to fix this issue, which is a big one in the meta-analysis world. So what we're looking at is meta-analysis in social science as a way to continue to update the literature for researchers who don't have big grants to work off of. You can do this for very low cost, since especially these days most all the information is available online or via interlibrary loan. You can work with other people. You don't have to be in the same location, and kind of cross-check each other on analyzing the data. And it is something that is becoming more and more common in social science literature and is considered better than just summarizing articles like a literature review. This was my claim to fame, the first article off of the dissertation data. At this time, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for AIDS Intervention Research through the Medical College of Wisconsin. And you can see that 11-page article, as it ends up in print, was the strongest, I think, because it's about the needle sharing, lending, and borrowing, which is really what most people are interested in this topic area. So just take a look at that. But also, my worth is how many people through their articles have cited my study. And I just took a look at this the other day and found that there are 112 citations. So other people have included in their literature reviews what I found. Now, I've never had any curiosity to see who all has cited me. I suppose that's a hyperlink there, cited by 112, I could click on. For all I know, they're saying Sobiak is an idiot. She did it wrong or whatever. But I definitely did not go that far in this. But to do something, get it published, and have it cited, by over 100 other articles is a decent statistic. There's many people who write things and no one cares. Like no one ever includes it in there, even as a literature review. So it's got pretty good spread, I guess. Just taking a look at some of the other examples, there are meta-analysis. So here we're looking at interpersonal and computer-mediated interactions. Those are the variables being studied. In this particular article, they're looking at mediated health communication campaigns and behavior change. Leslie Snyder is a big. I only mention here this particular article because the author, Mike Allen, is from UW-Milwaukee, and he was my mentor in doing the meta-analysis. And he's kind of the king of metas around the country. That's his most likely style of methodology that he's chosen. So he's on many teams, both social and hard science, that use this technique. And that's really meta-analysis in a nutshell. So I will stop for now. And thank you.